So my name's Sharon, and how I started was, it was actually a couple of years ago now, when there was an issue with interpreters. They decided to stop working with Language Line, which is an interpreter agency, so there was a boycott of that agency. And it meant that there was a huge impact for me personally and for lots of deaf people. I wasn't able to have access to an interpreter when I was attending appointments for my child. And realised that it was affecting a lot of other deaf people in the community as well. So, you know, for medical appointments and all sorts of different things. So I decided to go to the Deaf Advice Service, you know, to try and work out a resolution. And they said, why don't you get in touch with Healthwatch? So, you know, they told me about Healthwatch, and I decided to get involved and start doing some work with the organisation and the Deaf Advice Service at the same time. And we all worked together. We developed and set up some workshops, some campaigning. It was going really, really well, but there's still a long way to go. So, for example, a client maybe would turn up to a doctor's appointment or a hospital appointment, and they would say, oh great, there's an interpreter booked. So they'd be waiting at reception and waiting and waiting, and then there would be no interpreter there. And they'd say, oh well, we've booked one. They're on their way, you know, and this person would just be waiting and waiting, maybe an hour, and they'd say, look, you know, what's going on? And they'd be told, oh, sorry, there's no interpreter. Are you okay just to sort of write down on a piece of paper? Will you cope? And that's one example of things that happen, you know, that people don't, that interpreters seemingly don't turn up. So it's a question of, have they actually booked someone? Are they covering up for the fact that they haven't? So it creates a lot of barriers. You know, if you imagine a conversation with a doctor, it could be really critical and the communication is just breaking down. Another example perhaps would be for home visits, for perhaps health visitors visiting deaf people in their home to talk to parents about their child, and if there's no interpreter, the health visitor often feels quite stuck because they've got certain questions that they have to ask in order to carry out an assessment. You know, and they're unable to communicate with the person, especially if they've got no awareness of deaf needs and deaf culture. It could be the parents are deaf and, you know, they need to understand what's going on with their child, and the impact is just huge. To be honest, I could talk all day for hours and hours about these different examples, but, you know, there's just a couple. The first time I felt really incredibly proud actually to work with Healthwatch, because these were the top people in like the CCG, the top people in these organisations, and so to build those relationships I was quite overwhelmed, but at the same time I was really pleased because they were taking note and they were listening to us and watching what we were doing. So we started working with Healthwatch, with Deaf Advice, and they realised that I've sort of become an advocate for the deaf community to really encourage and promote those working relationships with the deaf community, the key people in the community and the key people in these different organisations, and get people talking to each other. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned, you know, how to work with those people and what people's different roles are, how to approach different situations, what's the best way to build those relationships. Plus, I've realised that they have sort of different contacts. So me as one single deaf person in the deaf community, there isn't really a huge amount of contact, whereas you start building those relationships, and one thing leads to another, and you can have a conversation with somebody and they then pass you on to somebody else, they then pass you on to somebody else, and it really raises the profile of the deaf community. So I'm trying to really bring them with me along in this journey, and hopefully it will grow, but I've really enjoyed the experience. I'm certainly aware that deaf people have been going to the Deaf Advice Service in Sheffield and saying, look, I've got this issue. There's actually been 2 or 3 complaints recently, and I'm pleased because it's word of mouth, you know, it's spreading around the deaf community that they're talking to each other and saying, oh, if you've had this problem, you can go to the Deaf Advice. Or you can go to Disability Sheffield, or, you know, so people are starting to become aware of where they can go, and I think those organisations, those external organisations can start working with Healthwatch. You know, we have to work together to try and make the changes that need to be made. like the workshops, for example, with the deaf community, the more work we do with the deaf community, hopefully eventually they will, you know, realise that the access is there and the support is there, but it's a slow process because people are sort of starting all of a sudden to go, oh, I can complain, I do have a right to do that, because for so long there's not been that opportunity, and so we've got to try and entice people in, but there's a lot of stuff just sort of bubbling under the surface, and hopefully these workshops as they continue will encourage people to really come out of their shell and say what needs to be said.